All right, welcome back, everybody. Thank you for bearing with me the last few weeks. I'm very excited to be back here with all of you. We're going to spend today talking a lot about professional communication, more specifically what I like to think of as technical communication. And I want to use today as a bit of a brainstorming session to help you figure out what you're going to do for your second speech. I know I utter those words and a bunch of people panic because some of you haven't even gotten through your first speech yet. Part of how I've designed this course is to give you all the tools that you need to get your speeches done early on in the semester, and then you'll have plenty of time to practice those when you actually get into your major speeches. So you had a lot of time before your first major speech in this class. The trade-off that goes with that is that you have 2 more speeches to give between now and the end of the semester. So I know some of you are already in panic mode. I'm going to try and use today to help calm you down. So we're going to talk about professional communication. I'm going to give you some ideas of what you might do for your speeches. These are ideas that I would recommend for my lab students. I'd encourage you all to talk to your own lab instructors because they might have different expectations or different ideas for you. But we're going to use today to try and get your brains flowing and do some invention work. So we'll start off today with our participation question. If you want to get those out, go ahead and take out a sheet of paper and a pen. I used to say that you could turn those in via email copies. I'd actually prefer hard copies, so if you don't have a pen and paper, see if you can borrow from a neighbor. And just as a reminder, put your name, your lab instructor's name, your lab section number, and finally your answer to this question. So your question for today is going to be, which of the following best describes where you're at professionally? You might have no idea what you want to major in yet. Maybe you're a first-year student, maybe you're a third-year student, you just haven't quite figured it out yet. Totally fine. You might have a couple ideas for possible majors, but you haven't declared one yet. Maybe you've declared a major, but you're not sure that it's right for you. Maybe you've declared a major and you know what kind of job you want to get with it, but you're not sure if you're going to be able to get that job. Maybe you've declared a major and you know what kind of job you want, or maybe you're about to graduate and you already have a job lined up for next year in your field. So you can go ahead and fill those out again, your name, your lab instructor's name, your section number, and the answer to this question. When you're ready, you can bring those up here. There's a folder. I'll try to keep them relatively organized, so you can take that up here when you're ready. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
we just put the lab instructor's name on there?
Yeah.
If you don't know, your section.
Thank you all. Let me take a quick pulse of the room. How many of you said A for this one? A couple of you, okay, totally fine. How many of you said B? C? Quite a few, okay. D? E? Lots of E's, okay. F? Anybody got with job lined up? Congratulations, very exciting. There's lots of different places where you can be. Anywhere you are on this list is okay. My hope is that in 2 years, 4 years, for some of you 7 or 8 years, some of you maybe not so much, that you'll be able to leave UND and have a job lined up, a good job in a field that you want. My goal for all of you is to get the job that is best for you. But I've also recognized that there's a lot of different changes happening in higher ed, and that is that a lot of students are not just picking one major and sticking with it. If they are picking one major and sticking with it, they might get into that field or they might not get into that field. But what I've seen from a lot of studies is that actually millennials are far less likely than Gen Xers or baby boomers to actually pick one career and stick with it their entire lives. It's much more common for people your age, even people my age, to pick a career and then change careers maybe 4 or 5 times over the course of a lifetime. So I want you to feel comfortable wherever you're at on this list. It's all okay. But I want you also to use this second speech as a chance to try and figure out who you are professionally and to try to use your public speaking skills to try and share what you know of your field with other people. So this is designed to be kind of thinking about your future and the next steps that might await you, knowing that you don't have to be locked into them, and also knowing that all of you are in different places. When I do this in the spring, I get lots of people closer to D, E, and F. When I do this in the fall, I get lots of people closer to A, B, and C. So it kind of depends on where you're at, but regardless of where you are in your college career, there's a speech waiting for you that you can give to try and teach your classmates something new about your professional lives. So we're going to do some just free-range brainstorming, just some basic word association. I'm curious, what comes to mind when you hear the phrase technical communication? Who do you think of? What other words come to mind? What is technical communication? What does it usually look like? Nobody wants to venture a guess? I know it's been a little while. I'm pretty comfortable with awkward silence. Okay.
Mechanics talking about cars.
Okay, mechanics talking about cars come to mind. So people in a very specialized field talking about something that most people don't know a whole lot about. They have some special training. They have some special knowledge. How many of the rest of you thought of something like mechanical engineers or somebody like that? What other things come to mind when you think of technical in technical communication? Yeah.
User manual.
A user manual, yeah. How many of you have actually sat down and read your car manual cover to cover? I actually had a student in my last class yesterday who had done that. Good for him. I don't read manuals, but that's a lot of what comes to mind when people think of technical communication. It's a manual rather than like a book or a poem or a play. Right? You sit down and you read technical communication. A lot of people think it's very dry, it's very boring. It's usually just the bare bones details, usually in outline format, and not a whole lot more than that. When I think of technical communication, I think a lot of people picture something like what you said, or Dilbert. You know, an old white guy sitting in a cubicle crunching numbers or crunching data. A lot of people think of technical communication as dry and boring and not very exciting. And I think for a lot of up until really the end of the 20th century, a lot of that was true. If you've ever tried to put together IKEA furniture, if you've ever tried to follow a step-by-step guide to something, usually you don't want to read it in a whole lot of detail. You're looking for what you need right now and just the basics of what you need without a whole lot of fluff or style or excitement. I think that's starting to change a lot. I think in the 21st century, a lot of technical communication is starting to shift more in the model of graphic design. It's trying to be user-friendly, and that's a lot of what technical communication does generally, but it's also trying to be stylistic. It's trying to be creative. It's trying to get you to understand what you need to understand in ways that are not so traditional, not just flipping through a manual and finding the page you need, but think of how many things that you used to go to a manual for that you could maybe find on YouTube now as a video, or things that you could find maybe laid out in ways that are not just a bunch of boring text. There's lots of different things that are happening in technical communication that can make it much more exciting. But the reason I talk to you about technical communication is not to tell you about that style of writing and speaking, but rather to get you thinking about the origins of where the term technical comes from. When I think of technical communication, I don't think of just dry and boring manuals. I think of very specialized language. I think of experts sharing their expertise with non-experts. And the reason I go to that is because a lot of what happened with the term technical is that it comes all the way back to ancient Greece, and it comes back to the same time when Plato and Aristotle were trying to figure out what's going on in the public sphere, how are people deliberating about different things, at the beginning of when they were writing about speaking and talking about speaking. So Plato is trying to figure out what is the origin of public speaking and who is responsible for being an expert in that, and can someone really be an expert in that? So he has a dialogue called the Gorgias, and in the Gorgias, Plato coins the term rhetoric, which is one of the early terms that we get for public speaking. Rhetoric is very closely related to oratory, and it's designed to help shape the reality around us through words. And when Plato is talking about rhetoric, he coins this term because he's trying to catalog all the different experts who are available in ancient Greece. So there are people who are politicians, there are people who are artists, there are people who are bakers, right? He's trying to figure out what is a worthy profession of study. And in Greek, the term techne, where we get the term technical, is really more like a profession. It's less like that dry and detailed and very basic kind of communication. What it actually means is specialized communication. Somebody can take up expertise in an area, and they can be excited about it, and they can share their expertise, but they usually have to go through training, and other people who are not experts usually look up to them. And he's looking around at these people who are orators, or more specifically logographers, and he's saying, okay, you claim that you have expertise in public speaking, but your public speeches are about topics that other experts cover. And so you cover things from architecture, you cover things from math, you cover things from physics. What is it that makes public speaking a techne? What is it that makes it an area of professional expertise instead of just a hobby or a knack or a skill? And so for a long time, even as Aristotle was writing some beginning thoughts about rhetoric and public speaking, Plato is very skeptical that communication, or public speaking specifically, is an art worthy of study, that someone can become an expert in. And part of why Plato is afraid of this is because in politics, a lot of people are using public speaking to try and influence politicians, and the political situation at the time is not going very well. And so Plato's very skeptical that anyone can become an expert in everything, which is kind of what communication requires, and instead they're just kind of using a hobby for flattery, or they're just using it for pandering, and it's not really a skill. This is a fight that people have been having for 2,500 years, going back to the origins of public speaking, and it's a fight that we're still having today in the 21st century. A lot of people will speak ill of communication as a discipline, and we'll talk more about this later on in the semester, but communication in American universities didn't used to be its own major until about 100 years ago. And the reason for that is this same debate that Plato started. So I'm not here to necessarily convince you to become a communication major, though I'd certainly be happy if some of you did that. I know that you all have various areas of expertise, but I share this with you because this is a debate that we're still having. And the example I'll give you to show that is from one of my favorite television shows, The Simpsons, where they actually make fun of communication majors and say it's not really an area worthy of study.
Son, I'm afraid that leg is hanging by a thread.
Chico, must be tanto king.
Oh, your playing days are over, my friend. But you can always fall back on your degree in communications. Oh, dear Lord.
I know, it's funny, Major. No Chico and nothing.
So this is a mentality that people in communication studies have been fighting for not just the last 100 years in American universities, but really for the last 2,500 years. And as somebody who has not one, not two, but 3 degrees in communication, I can speak to its value. If any of you want to have that conversation after class, I can tell you that it's really important. But the other thing that goes along with that is that regardless of which field you're in, you're still going to need communication skills. I asked you on the first day of class why most of you were here, and a lot of people said it's required, right? And you kind of said it and rolled your eyes. It's required because a lot of university administrators have decided that regardless of what field you're in, whether it's communication or physics or biology or sociology or philosophy, you're going to need communication skills. And that's not unique to the University of North Dakota. I taught at Texas A&M, and I taught a class in technical communication specifically, and the head of the petroleum engineering department helped us create that class because he was having such a hard time with his petroleum engineers. He asked people who worked for Schlumberger and ExxonMobil and different companies that work with oil, and he said, you know, what do you have to say about our graduates at Texas A&M? And these oil executives said back to them, they're really smart, they're really hardworking, they don't know how to speak, and they don't know how to write. That's kind of scary, because I also have the same head of the petroleum engineering department on video saying that you can't make it as a petroleum engineer if you can't give a basic presentation, if you don't know how to write a report. You're going to have the lowest level petroleum engineering jobs, and you're not going to be able to advance your career if you don't have good communication skills. There's a rhetorician from the 20th century named Richard McKeon. He's in my field. He studies communication and more specifically rhetoric, and he said communication and rhetoric are architectonic. What he meant by that is that communication skills are kind of the building block of every other career that you could possibly have. So regardless of what field you're in, you might not think communication is valuable, but I think that if you have a hard time advancing your career, chances are it's because of communication skills. That's one of the top skills that a lot of employers look for, and if you're struggling to advance in your career, you might want to sharpen the same skills you're getting from me now. So we're going to talk about a couple different ideas for how you might use those communication skills for your second speech. I said that I wanted today to be about invention, and some of you are probably panicking because you don't really know what field you're going into, and you're like, how am I supposed to give a speech if I don't know what my major is? And I have no idea what kind of career I want. For those of you who are in that boat, you could talk about some things that are related to careers generally. There's lots of different articles out there, some better than others, that talk about what you need in order to apply for and in order to get a job. Two of the most important documents that you can produce to help you in that process are resumes and cover letters. I'll give you a couple suggestions on what to do for those things, and I think they are closely tied to some of the skills that you're getting in here. So I'll give you the basics of those, but if any of you wants to expand on either one of these topics, you could do that for your second speech. Or you could talk about skills for interviewing. So let's start with resumes. How many of you have ever written a resume? A lot of you. How many think you're going to have the same resume today that you're going to have when you go on the job market, whether it's in a year or 6 months or 2 years? Anyone? Your resume is probably going to change. A lot of people don't update their resumes very regularly. I have an academic resume called the Curriculum Vitae that I update about every 3 months or so. It's important that you keep your resume up to date. So some of you might have a draft of it, and that's a good thing. Some of you are also, almost all of you, are going to have to revise that draft at some point. There are skills that I've taught you in here that will be useful when you get to that process. There's lots of things to keep in mind. The first of which are the 5 canons, right? You have 5 canons. The first 3 really apply more to writing. It's not just something that you do for speeches, but it can be for any writing that you do, whether that's written text or a speech. So in terms of invention, one of the things you're going to have to decide is what goes on my resume, and more importantly, in a lot of cases, what doesn't go on my resume. Some of you might have a little bit of work experience right now. That work experience may be related to the field that you eventually want to go into, but for a lot of you, it's probably more like retail work. Some of you might have had a summer working at a restaurant, or you might have been a camp counselor or a lifeguard or something like that. That is valuable experience, and maybe as you're leaving here, that is something that you'd want to list on a resume, but chances are when you get beyond the entry level, those kinds of things are going to get cut. A lot of people like to list everything they've ever done on their resume, and a lot of employers look at that and say, wow, this person's really trying to make themselves look good, and they really don't have the skills or values that we want to have in this job. Another thing to think about is arrangement. A lot of resumes go chronologically. We talked about organizational patterns, chronological, problem solution, cause effect, topical, right? Your resume, for a lot of you, is probably chronological. It probably either starts with your most recent job and works backwards, or it starts with your first job and works forwards. That's pretty common. It used to be pretty common for resumes, but a lot of jobs are actually moving away from that model and moving toward what's called a functional resume. A functional resume is more topical, and what it includes is usually not just those jobs in the order that you did them, but it categorizes those jobs based on the kinds of skills that you used in those jobs and gives you a little bit more time to talk about them. If you just list where you had your job and when, it doesn't tell your employer a whole lot about you. So you might consider looking up a functional resume and trying that out. A couple other things to think about related to style. A lot of you will list underneath your jobs the kinds of tasks that you had at that job to try and show that you already know how to do the kinds of things that the employer is asking you to do. You're going to want to be really creative in those action verbs that you choose. Led a team, created a document, worked with others. Whatever it is, those action verbs will signal to your employer what it is that you have to bring to the table. Another thing to consider is design. A lot of people used to have hard copy resumes. They used to have a very standard format. They all looked the same. If you're going into a field that is a little bit more creative, if you're going into, let's say, graphic design or theater or even something like computer science, you might be able to actually demonstrate through your resume that you have design skills and computer skills that make you stand out from other people. If they see a creative looking resume, sometimes employers will take notice of it, and maybe if you are about to be in the no pile, they'll say, well, wait a minute, maybe not. So you can use the 5 canons to your advantage. The other thing that's really important that you learn how to do is audience analysis. We talked about this a few weeks ago. I mentioned when we talked about audience analysis that a lot of speakers start off self-centered. And I said that not in the pompous or arrogant kind of sense, but in the sense of when you craft a speech, you're thinking about everything that I need to do from my end. It's a lot harder to think about things from an audience member's perspective. A lot of new college students or people applying for their first job also get into that self-centered mentality. I'm drafting a resume. What do I need to put into a resume? How do I demonstrate why this job is good for me? That's actually the opposite of what you want to do. Most of the time when you're applying for a new job, you have to look for what is the employer looking for? How do I know what they're looking for, and how do I demonstrate what I can do for their company? Chances are if there's a position open somewhere, there's one of two things going on. Either they're expanding and they need someone to do something that nobody knows how to do yet, and maybe you can show that you know how to do it. Or somebody has recently left the company. Maybe they've been fired, maybe they just retired or got another job. But you want to figure out what is it that the people in this company already do, and how do you fit their needs? They're not interested in the fact that you want this job. They're not interested in this fact that, in the fact that you want to move to Chicago. What they care about is what you're going to do for them. And so you have to be able to get into their mindset and try to craft that. Now, I know that not a lot of college classes teach this, which is part of why I'm okay going over it. Some of you might get this through Career Services, and I think that's a really good move if you want to go check out Career Services, but that's a basic primer on resumes. Let's talk about cover letters now. I asked how many of you had written resumes. How many of you have ever written a cover letter? Quite a bit fewer of you, probably about half. Cover letters are a really difficult genre. A lot of people don't know how to do them. My guess is that if you're writing a cover letter for the first time, you're probably going to want to look up what a cover letter in your field looks like. But a cover letter is a chance not only to talk about you and your skills and values and what you bring to the company, but it's a chance to enhance your resume. It's a chance to not just rehash the jobs that you've had, but to go into a little bit more detail about what you've learned from the jobs that you've had and who you are as a person. So you want to make sure that when you write a cover letter, you stick to the convention of a letter. You still need a heading, you still need an intro, body, and conclusion, you need a sign-off. But a lot of what you're trying to show is not just what you've put in your resume, but more than that. What's unique about you? What makes you stand out from the other applicants? What kinds of skills and values can you bring to the table? When employers read cover letters, they're often looking for your personality, and they're looking for how well you fit within the company. So I'll give you an example. I had a student in Texas who was writing a cover letter for my technical communication class, and the student wrote a cover letter that sounds like this. And I want you to pay attention to it because I want you to see what you hear when I say this cover letter to you. I'll summarize it. He said, dear committee, dear committee, dear search committee, whatever the title was. I am very fortunate. I'm very lucky. My family has been very blessed. Jesus has blessed us that we've always had money. We've always had a roof over our heads. We've always had food on the table. So I haven't yet had to work, but I'm very excited to work at your company. Thank you for your time. If you're the employer, from an audience analysis perspective, what do you hear in that language of that cover letter? I don't need a job. What makes you say that?
I'm so fortunate I have everything.
Yeah, I already have everything. You might hear a little bit of entitlement. You might hear a little bit of lack of hard work. The person might not have a very strong work ethic. Are there other things you heard in that cover letter?
Preachy.
It's preachy. What do you mean by that?
I don't think we bring Jesus to work.
Okay, so you heard religion in that cover letter. I had to have a sit-down conversation with this student. I pulled him into my office, and I said, I really appreciate what you're trying to do here. Can you explain to me what some of the religious references are doing in your draft? And he said, well, I'm a conservative Christian. I live in rural Texas. I'm trying to get a job in rural Texas. My employer is probably Christian, and so I thought I was doing audience analysis and identification by showing, hey, I'm a Christian too, and we share this Christian value. And what I said to this student is that in some places in rural Texas or rural North Dakota, that might work. If you're looking for a job in Devil's Lake, that might be something that you could do. If you put religion or politics or other controversial subjects in your cover letter, chances are if you're applying for a job in a bigger city like Fargo or Minneapolis or Chicago, that's going to get you in the no pile right away. And the reason for that is not that you're religious. It's okay that you're religious. The reason for that is it signals to your employer that you might not be able to understand, or you might think that your religion is a starting point to get you a job. You might not be able to work well with other people who come from different backgrounds. And so they're already flagging you as somebody who might not be the best team player because you might not have ever encountered someone who's Muslim, Jewish, atheist, agnostic, Sikh, Hindu, whatever, right? You want to make sure that your cover letter reflects the best of you. So these are just a couple of genres that those of you who haven't picked a major yet could talk about for your second speech. There's also a lot of really good books out there and lots of good articles about how to do interviews successfully. Another genre that you might take up is explaining what it is that excites you about your major, and more specifically than that, being able to explain what it is that you do and what it is that you don't do. I've had a couple of different jobs, and I'm going to chronicle them in a minute for you, but every job I've had to explain what I don't do, much more than what I actually do. Some of you might have seen that internet meme that was floating around a couple of years ago, and it was like, what this group thinks I do, what this group thinks I do, what this group thinks I do, what I actually do. That's kind of where this idea is coming from. So I'll give you a sense of what this might look like. I worked in a writing center. That was my first job that I had. I actually worked in 2 different writing centers. And I would every day get students coming in, they'd hand me a draft and they'd say, this is terrible, fix it for me, as a command. And I would look at them and I would say, that's not really what we do here. If any of you have ever been to a writing center, a lot of times writing centers operate under the teach a person how to fish kind of mentality rather than give a person a fish mentality. In other words, I could sit here, I have the knowledge, I have the wherewithal to fix up your draft and mark all the spelling and grammar mistakes, but that's not really going to help you a whole lot if you haven't gone through the invention, arrangement, and style that you need to do on your end. If you don't have a clear thesis, if your ideas are not clear and coherent, if they're not arranged well in a way that makes sense, fixing your spelling and grammar is not going to do a whole lot for you. If you're at that point where you've gone through invention, arrangement, and style and you really need grammar help, it's one thing for me to fix it, it's another thing for me to teach you how to fix it so that you don't make the same mistakes over and over again. And I would have this conversation regularly with students about what writing centers do and what they don't do. I'd encourage you, if you haven't had a chance to go to the writing center, a lot of people also think that it's for remedial work and that you only go to the writing center if you're bad at writing. A lot of the best writers are the most frequent clients at writing centers. They are the ones who say, I'm a pretty good writer, but I'm just struggling with this particular thing, and I think I know where I want to go with it, but I'm not sure yet. So that's one job that I had to explain all the time. I also had a moment in my life where I was working 3 jobs, and one of them was at a non-Starbucks coffee shop. And I worked at a coffee shop, and I would have customers walk in. My favorite were the businessmen who'd come in at 5:30 or 6:30 in the morning, still eyes glazed over. They'd stare at the menu like this, and they'd say, I'll have a grande. And as soon as they uttered any Starbucks terminology, I responded to them, no, you won't. And it was my way of teasing them and waking them up because we didn't have grande and tall and venti and all the other Starbucks language. I think that's kind of silly. So I would tease them, but I'd also have regular conversations about we're out of this, what would you like instead, or just kind of having regular conversation with customers. My favorite part of that job was not serving coffee, it was interacting with people. When I got that job, my father joked that the hardest part of that job is serve people a cup of coffee and tell them it's $5. That's day one. On day two, he said, serve them a cup of coffee, tell them it's $5 with a straight face. So we have lots of stereotypes about what people do and what they don't do, and some of you might get in trouble for other people critiquing what it is that they think you do instead of what you actually do. I worked as a camp counselor, and my same father used to tease me all the time and say, why don't you go get a real job? I have a friend who worked at that summer camp with me. She now works for the New York Times, and one of her first pieces in the New York Times was why being a camp counselor is a real job. It was actually taken up, and a lot of people said that it taught you very good skills of how to do teamwork. It helped with critical thinking. It helped with problem solving. I'd also have my campers who'd come to me at 11 o'clock at night in an all-male cabin, and they'd come to me and they'd say, Mommy, can I have a snack before bed? And I'd say, I'm not your mommy, and you certainly don't need more sugar, right? So explaining what it is you do and what you don't do. Then I decided I wanted to become a communication major, and all the time I'd get, oh, so what are you going to do with that when you graduate? There aren't any jobs for communication majors. Hi, here I am, I'm your lecture instructor. There are lots of jobs for people with communication majors, but I'd also get people asking me, oh, is that like journalism? We'll talk about this later on in the semester, but communication is a very broad field, and journalism is probably the exact opposite of what I studied as an undergrad. I really wasn't interested in that. And then I was a graduate student, and we have lots of stereotypes about graduate students and what they're capable of and what their value is. I'll tell you that one of the hard parts of being a graduate student was explaining over and over again what my research was and why it was valuable. When I defended my master's thesis, which was about genocide, I had a committee member ask me in my defense, how would you explain this to Rick Perry? Rick Perry was the governor of Texas at the time, and I had to explain why my master's thesis was relevant to someone who otherwise probably wouldn't care about it. I had to do the same thing with my dissertation. I wrote a 200-page dissertation that I'm now turning into a book. I had to explain that book in about 30 seconds to a minute in order to try and get a job. I had to explain what it was and why it was interesting and why I was studying it and who it's relevant for. Last but not least, there's lots of stereotypes about what professors do. I have no idea how Ross Geller got tenure with all the time that he spent at the coffee shop. But there's lots of stereotypes about what professors do and how much time they spend doing what. And we had a conversation when I was in graduate school about a neighbor of a professor complaining in town that someone was mowing his lawn at 1 o'clock on a Thursday. And he's like, man, I wish I had time to mow my lawn at 1 o'clock on a Thursday. What I'll tell you about professor life is that it may look like that we don't use our time very wisely. There are very few weeks when I spend only 40 hours working. Usually it's closer to 50 or 60. The public speaking part of my job as director of public speaking is only 60% of my time at the university. The other 40% of my time is spent doing research. So there's lots of ways that you can challenge stereotypes. All of you, regardless of what major you're in, regardless of what field you're in, will have somebody who questions your choice, and you can actually defend that choice. We're going to watch an example of that. This is Taylor Mali. Taylor Mali is an English teacher / slam poet / comedian. He's one of my favorites. I'm a big fan of his. My lab students know that from me. We're going to watch Taylor Mali, who was sitting at a meal with his family, and somebody, I think it was a drunk relative of his, asked him, you're a teacher. What's the value in that? What do teachers make? And he was teasing him. And a lot of you, if you are going to get challenged on the job that you have, it's going to come from a drunk relative trying to say, you shouldn't be doing that. You should be doing this instead. So Taylor Mali got this question, what do teachers make? And he decided he wasn't having it, so he decided to refute that. Let's see what that looks like.
What teachers make, or objection overruled, or if things don't work out, you can always go to law school. He says the problem with teachers is, what's a kid going to learn from someone who decided that his best option in life was to become a teacher? He reminds the other dinner guests that it's true what they say about teachers, those who can do and those who can't teach. I decide to bite my tongue instead of his, and resist the urge to remind the other dinner guests that it's also true what they say about lawyers, because we're eating after all, and this is supposed to be polite conversation. I mean, you're a teacher, Taylor. Come on, be honest. What do you do? And I wish he hadn't done that. Ask I make kids work harder than they ever thought they could. I can make a C+ feel like a Congressional Medal of Honor, and I can make an A- feel like a slap in the face. How dare you waste my time with anything less than your very best? I make kids sit through 40 minutes of study hall in absolute. No, you may not work in groups. No, you cannot ask me a question. Why won't I let you go to the bathroom? Because you're bored and you don't really have to go to the bathroom, do you? I make parents tremble in fear when I call home at around dinner time. Hi, this is Mr. Molly. Hope I haven't called it a bad time. I just wanted to talk to you about something that your son said today in class. To the biggest bully in the grade, he said, leave that kid alone. I still cry sometimes, don't you? And that was the noblest act of courage that I have ever seen. I make parents see their children for who they are, who they can be. You want to know what I make? I make kids wonder. I make them question. I make them criticize. I make them apologize and mean it. I make them write. And then I make them read. I make them spell. Definitely beautiful. Define nightly, beautiful. Until they will never misspell either one of those words again. I make them show all their work in math class and then hide it on their final drafts in English. I make them realize that if you've got this, then you follow this. And if somebody ever tries to judge you based on what you make, you give them this. Here, let me break it down for you so you know what I say is true. Teachers make a goddamn difference. And what about you?
So that's another genre you could take up, is defending your career choice or maybe trying to get other people involved in your career. There's one more option that I want to bring to your attention today. Don't worry about what's up here yet. That option is to teach your audience something about your field. Maybe there's a concept that really interests you. Maybe there's a theory or an idea or a process that really interests you about your field that you can make sense of and you can teach and demonstrate to them. After all teaching is, in some sense, public speaking. You're never just teaching, or rarely just teaching one-on-one. Usually you're teaching to a large audience. And so one thing that you can do is teach your audience something that they don't know about your field. I've had lots of really good demonstration speeches. So I'm going to go ahead and do that with something that's sort of from my field. It also shares with other fields. If you read today's chapter, you saw that there was a concept in there called Monroe's motivated sequence. Monroe's motivated sequence is a technique for persuasion. The other way of thinking about it as it relates to the speech context is it's an organizational pattern that you can use. It's a very persuasive organizational pattern that gets other people to do what you want them to do. And it does this by basically doing an emotional roller coaster. It gets you very, very nervous, and then it calms you down, and then it gets you excited, and then it pressures you to try and take action. So I'm going to demonstrate to you what Monroe's motivated sequence looks like. Monroe's motivated sequence was developed by a man named Alan Monroe in the 1930s, and it's still around today, and you'll start seeing it everywhere because it works. It works really well for that same reason of it manipulates your emotions. So we'll talk about the different parts of that, and we'll see what that looks like. The first step of Monroe's motivated sequence is to get your audience's attention. This is your basic attention getter, your basic introduction. I've had lots of students come to my office over the years and say, I don't know how to start my speech. I don't have a good opening line. And I'll remind you of when we talked about intros and conclusions that your textbook gives you a lot of different examples of what you might do for this. Relating the topic to the audience, telling a joke, asking a rhetorical question, telling a story. Whatever it is, it's going to get your attention. It's going to introduce you to the topic. Monroe's motivated sequence often operates through advertising. You're never going to be able to watch an infomercial again without seeing Monroe's motivated sequence everywhere, but it's getting you to pay attention to something, and it's getting you to care about it. From there, Monroe's motivated sequence goes into a standard problem-solution organizational pattern. So the second step that it has is what Monroe called the need. This is the problem step, and it's usually a problem that you didn't know that you had. So the problem that I'm going to give you today is that you all have terrible dandruff. I already see a couple of you scratching. I'm just teasing you a little bit. I don't know if you have dandruff. I don't really care if you have dandruff, but that's the metaphor we're going to work with. And the needs step of Monroe's motivated sequence makes that problem as scary as it possibly can. So you might think, dandruff, not really a big deal. Except when I tell you that if you have terrible dandruff and you go for a job interview, they're going to think you're gross and that you don't shower. so you might not get the job you want. Or I'll tell you that you might go on a date, and they might think you're gross and don't shower, and you won't be able to date the person that you want. Or maybe your friends are going to think you're gross, and they're all going to leave you alone. The need step is trying to make a very serious problem because fear is one of the most powerful emotional motivators. A lot of people respond very well to fear, and if someone feels afraid, they're more likely to do what you want them to do. So it goes into this problem. What do you think might be the next step then? Yeah, there's some kind of solution. Monroe called the third step of this satisfaction. It's your basic problem solution format. So you might have terrible dandruff. I gave you all these reasons why you should be afraid that you have dandruff, but don't worry. Don't worry, it's going to be okay. How do I know that it's going to be okay? Because I have the solution for you. The solution is if you buy my particular brand of shampoo, and I'm not endorsing this one, I just picked a random dandruff shampoo. But if you buy my brand of shampoo, that dandruff is going to go away. So you were all scared. I gave you all these reasons to panic. Now I'm going to tell you if you buy my shampoo, then we'll be all right, and you won't have to worry about it. That's a standard problem solution format. That's not all that new or all that innovative. Where Monroe differs from previous people who have talked about this is he actually doesn't stay just in the present. The problem was in the past. I'm giving you a present solution. Where Monroe goes with this is actually toward the future. Because if people just say problem solution, okay, I'll consider buying that shampoo, and you leave it at that, they're not actually very likely to go to the grocery store and to pick it up. And so he goes a couple steps further with this. One step that he does is what he calls visualization. Visualization is either picturing how terrible your life will be if you don't listen to me, or picturing more likely how wonderful your life will be if you just do what I say. So I gave you all those reasons in the need step, the problem step, to panic. Now I'm going to tell you that if you do what I'm actually telling you to do and buy my shampoo, you'll get that job that you wanted, you'll get the girl you wanted on the date, and your friends will be back to hanging out with you. It's picturing how great your life will be and how terrible it is now in order to try and further motivate you to do things. But Monroe doesn't even stop there. If any of you have watched an infomercial, you'll know what the next step is coming. The last step is action. It's not just saying there is a solution, go buy this shampoo, but it's going to tell you where to get it, it's going to tell you how to get it, it's going to tell you 30 times to go get it, it's going to give you the number of where you can call to go get it, or the website, right? You've all seen this in action. You're never going to be able to watch TV again without seeing Monroe's motivated sequence all over the place. But it's really specific, and the reason that the action step works is because of that specificity. It tells your audience exactly what they need to do in order to make it work. So this is a common idea that pops up all the time in advertising and marketing and business. It's also very common in public speaking. And so it's a strategy that some of you might use as we're thinking to, dare I say, your third speech, your deliberations for this class. A lot of you will probably use Monroe's motivated sequence in some capacity to try and motivate your audience to take some action to solve a problem that you see in politics. So normally I would have you all watch this speech from Stephen Lucas's class. We'll watch a minute or two of it. But this, the girl from this class is actually a real student at the University of Wisconsin. You can tell from the video and from some of the stuff that she says in her speech that it's from probably about 25 years ago because she's talking about AIDS. She has the Rachel haircut from Friends, and she's dressed very much in 90s clothing. But she uses Monroe's motivated sequence to try and get her classmates to do something that I think is something that I'm very passionate about, and that's donating blood. So she walks through this speech, and we'll see the first couple of minutes of it. Watch for the steps of Monroe's motivated sequence.
Are you at least 17 years old? Do you weigh more than 110 pounds? Do you consider yourself fairly healthy? If you answered yes to all of these questions, you should be donating blood every 2 months. In my survey of the class, I found that only 50% of you have ever donated blood before, and that only 1 out of 13 of you donate on a regular basis. The lack of participation of eligible donors is a serious problem that requires immediate action. Through extensive research and 2 years of faithfully donating blood, I've come to realize the magnitude of this problem and just how easy the solution can be. Today, I would like to show why blood donors are in such desperate need and encourage you to take action to combat this need. Let's first take a look at the overwhelming need for blood donors. The lack of participation of eligible blood donors poses a threat to the lives of many Americans. According to the American Red Cross web pages, where I've obtained an enormous amount of information, in the United States alone, someone undergoes a blood transfusion once every 3 seconds, which amounts to 3,000 gallons of blood every hour, day and night. People who benefit from donations range from cancer patients to organ transplant patients to surgical patients. Even premature infants and trauma victims benefit from donations. The need for blood never takes a vacation, and neither should donors. Let me tell you about Brooke, a 3-year-old girl with long, curly blonde hair and bright blue eyes. Brooke is a victim of cancer and had major surgery to remove a large tumor in her abdomen. She has spent approximately half of her life in the hospital, receiving chemotherapy and other treatments for infections that resulted from a decrease in her white blood cell count after each session. According to the Texas Children's Hospital, Brooke's treatment will require blood products with a replacement value of 508 units of blood, of which only 250 units have been replaced.
We're going to stop her there. But you can probably see from this video that she's gone from the attention step of giving you a whole bunch of shocking statistics to the need step of how few people actually donate blood, and then the sad story about this little girl to make you feel bad. From there, she goes into the satisfaction step of how it will help if you all go donate blood. But in that satisfaction step, she knows that a lot of people in her audience probably haven't donated blood before, might be scared of needles, might be scared of getting AIDS, and so she calms them down and says it's not just that you can solve the problem, but it doesn't have to be scary. Then she goes into the visualization step of how many people you can help with your blood donations, or my favorite part of her speech, she says, if nothing else sells you on donating blood, at the end of your blood donation, you get free juice and cookies. She gets very excited and tells you how great your life will be. And then in her action step, she tells you that there's actually a blood drive coming up on her campus. She tells you where it is, she tells you when it is, she tells you to sign up right now so that you don't forget. That's how Monroe's motivated sequence works, and it's usually very powerful. So we've seen kind of the serious example from public speaking. I'll give you one more that's just an infomercial because I happen to think it's funny. And that infomercial is for a real product for a problem that you did not know that you had.
Does the shoulder strap of your car cut into your shoulder? Is your shoulder strap too tight and annoying? Introducing the Teddy Bear, the cute little guy that eliminates all those problems. Designed to make driving more comfortable. The Teddy Bear snaps onto your shoulder strap and moves up and down to remove the pressure wherever you need it.
My shoulder strap used to pull so tight I could hardly breathe. Now with the Teddy Bear, I really enjoy traveling again.
The patent-pending design swivels to work from either the driver's side or passenger seat and fits all makes and models. Just snap it on, slide it where it relieves the pressure, and drive away. The Teddy Bear stays where you want it until you move it.
My wife used to always complain about the pressure from her shoulder belt. Not anymore.
And the Teddy Bear works so great, he got one for himself too.
The cuddly Teddy Bear is filled with soft, cushy beads, so it snuggles comfortably to your needs. Place it here, or anywhere you need to keep those irritating straps from digging in.
My shoulder strap was always digging in, but the Teddy Bear, it makes it comfortable for me to drive again.
The Teddy Bear works great for men and women and kids of all sizes.
Kids
It works
can
for
get one too,
everyone,
guys.
and it's easy to slide out of the way when not in use. The secure snap-on button makes the Teddy Bear safe and fun for infants and small children.
If you're in and out of your car all day like I am, you're really going to enjoy the comfort of the Teddy Bear.
Now you can have your own Teddy Bear and eliminate those annoying shoulder strap pains. Call and order your Teddy Bear right now.
Call 1-800-813-6691 and order your Teddy Bear for just $14.95 with shipping and handling. Mention this commercial and we'll give you a second Teddy Bear.
You get two.
You get two. Cuddly Teddy Bears for the low price of just $14.
All right, thank you all. Hopefully you have some good ideas for what to do for your second speech. I know that you're probably a little bit nervous about it, but I want to tell you that you can do it, and I'm excited to see what you all come up with.